I want a separation. I'm going back to him.
You mean your ex?
Michael Doyle had been married to Sarah for 11 years when she sat him down at their kitchen table on a Tuesday night in October and asked him for something he never thought a wife would ask her husband. She wanted his permission to date another man, not to end their marriage, not to walk away for good, just to go find out what she had been wondering about for the last 2 years. She told him his name was Ryan, the man she had loved before Michael, the man she had never fully stopped thinking about, and she promised him, looking him dead in the eyes, that she would come back if it didn't work. Michael sat there in silence, staring at the woman he had built an entire life with, trying to understand how 11 years of marriage had led to this exact moment. On the wall behind her hung their wedding photo, the two of them laughing under string lights, 26 years old and certain they had found forever. Near the front door sat a suitcase, already packed, already zipped, sitting there like it had been waiting for this conversation to happen before it could finally be allowed to leave. Sarah wasn't asking a question. She was announcing a decision that had already been made somewhere in her mind long before she opened her mouth, and all Michael had left was the choice of how he would respond to it. What he said next was not what she expected, and it was not what he expected either, because in that moment, something in him shifted that he did not see coming, and it would change the next year of both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Sarah Doyle ended up asking her husband for permission to chase a memory, you have to understand who Ryan Callahan was, and why his name still carried weight in her chest more than a decade after she had supposedly let him go. You have to understand what Michael did in the 60 seconds of silence after she asked, because in that silence, he made a decision that surprised everyone who would later hear this story, including the people who thought they knew him best. And you have to understand what happened when Sarah finally walked back through that door months later, because what she found waiting for her was not the same man, and not the same marriage she thought she was coming back to reclaim. There are three questions sitting at the center of this story, and each one will pull you further in than the last. The first question is simple on the surface but nearly impossible to answer honestly. Why would a woman who had spent 11 years building a life with one man ask permission to go back and finish something with another? Was it love that never fully died, or was it fear of spending the rest of her life wondering what she gave up? The second question belongs entirely to Michael, and it is the one that will decide whether you see him as a broken man or the smartest one in the room. What made him say yes, and what was he really agreeing to when he did? The third question is the one that will follow you long after this video ends because it does not have a clean answer. When Sarah finally made her choice, did she come back to Michael because she wanted to, or because she had nowhere else left to go? What you are about to hear is not a story about betrayal in the way you might expect. It is a story about a marriage that was tested in a way most people never have to face, and about two people who each had to decide separately what they actually wanted their lives to look like once the other person stopped being a guarantee. Stay with me, because the version of this story you think you're watching right now is not the one you are going to end up remembering. Michael and Sarah met in the fall of 2010, in a small college town in Ohio, at a coffee shop where Sarah worked weekend shifts to help pay for her nursing degree. Michael was 23, quiet, the kind of man who noticed things other people missed, and he had walked into that coffee shop 3 days in a row before he finally worked up the nerve to ask for her number instead of just his usual order. Sarah said yes almost immediately, though later she would admit she almost didn't, because at the time she was still getting over Ryan Callahan, her high school boyfriend of 4 years, the one everyone in her hometown assumed she would eventually marry. Ryan had left for the Marines right after graduation, and the distance had done what distance often does. It had quietly ended something neither of them had the courage to end out loud. For the first few years, Michael never felt like he was competing with a ghost. Sarah loved him in a way that felt whole, not partial, not borrowed from somewhere else. They got married in 2014 in a backyard ceremony with string lights and a borrowed sound system, and for a long time their life together looked exactly like the picture they had both hoped for. Michael built a steady career in construction management, Sarah became a labor and delivery nurse, and they bought a modest 3-bedroom house outside of Columbus where they planned to eventually raise the family they always talked about on quiet nights. Friends described them as the couple other couples measured themselves against: stable, affectionate, the kind of pair who still held hands at other people's weddings. The cracks did not appear all at once, and if you had asked Michael in real time to point to the moment things started changing, he would not have been able to name one. It was smaller than that. It was Sarah growing quieter during dinner, distracted in a way that felt different from being tired. It was her phone face down on the counter more often than it used to be. It was the night in the spring of 2022 when Ryan Callahan, now out of the military and living 2 states away, reconnected with Sarah through a mutual friend's wedding page online. The kind of small digital coincidence that feels harmless right up until it isn't. Michael noticed the messages increasing in frequency before he ever saw a single word of what they said, and he told himself, the way most people do, that it was nothing. Over the following months, Sarah began talking about Ryan more than she probably realized. Small comments dropped into unrelated conversations, memories that surfaced at strange times, an old song on the radio that made her go silent for a beat too long. Michael watched his wife drift somewhere he could not follow, and the hardest part was that nothing she was doing was technically wrong. She wasn't lying. She wasn't sneaking around in any obvious way. She was simply becoming someone who was, more and more often, somewhere else in her mind. Revisiting a version of her life that had never gotten the ending it was supposed to have, and Michael was left standing in the doorway of a marriage that still looked the same from the outside while something essential inside it had already begun to move. By the time Sarah finally said Ryan's name out loud to Michael directly, in the late summer of 2023, it did not land as a confession. It landed as something she had clearly already decided, a truth she had been carrying alone for longer than Michael wanted to imagine. She told him she still thought about what could have happened if Ryan hadn't left, if the timing had been different, if she had chosen differently at 22 instead of at 35. She did not say she regretted marrying Michael. She said something worse. In a way, she said she needed to know, once and for all, whether the life she had chosen was the life she actually wanted, or the life that had simply been available to her at the time. This is the story of what happened after that admission, of the request that followed it weeks later at their kitchen table, and of the decision Michael made that neither of them saw coming. The night it happened was a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of night that gives no warning of what it is about to become. Michael had come home from a long day on a job site outside of Dublin, Ohio, tired in the specific way that made him look forward to nothing more than dinner and silence. Sarah was already home, and something about the house felt different the moment he walked in, though he could not have told you what. She had made dinner, which she rarely did on weeknights anymore, and she had set the table with a kind of care that felt less like affection and more like preparation. The way a person sets a stage before delivering lines they have rehearsed many times in their head but never out loud. They ate mostly in silence, and Michael assumed it was ordinary tiredness until Sarah put her fork down halfway through the meal and asked if they could talk. Those 4 words had never once in 11 years of marriage preceded anything good, and Michael felt his stomach tight before she had said another sentence. She told him she needed to say something, and she needed him to let her finish before he responded, because if he interrupted her she was afraid she would lose the nerve to say all of it. Michael nodded, set his own fork down, and gave her the floor, not knowing that the next several minutes would be the ones he would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. Sarah told him about Ryan, about the conversations that had restarted months earlier, about the way those conversations had grown from occasional to nightly, about the feelings she thought she had buried at 22 that had resurfaced fully formed at 35. She was careful with her words, almost clinical, as if she had practiced saying this exact version of the truth so many times that the emotion had been sanded off the edges. And then she said the part Michael had not seen coming even after everything she had just admitted. She wanted his permission to take a break from their marriage, a real break, time and space to go see Ryan in person, to find out whether what she was feeling was real or whether it was simply the pull of an unfinished chapter she had never properly closed. She promised him with what sounded like complete sincerity that if it did not work out she would come home and she would choose their marriage for good without ever looking back again. Michael sat there for what felt like a very long time without saying a single word. He looked at the woman across the table, the same woman who had stood beside him at their wedding 11 years earlier, and tried to reconcile her with the person who had just asked him to essentially wait on standby while she went to find out if she loved someone else more. Part of him wanted to shout. Part of him wanted to get up and walk out the door before she could see him break. But underneath the shock, something else was happening in him too, something quieter and colder, a kind of clarity he had never expected to find in a moment like this, and it was that clarity more than anger or heartbreak that shaped what he said next. He told her he would agree to the break, but only under his own terms, not hers. He was not going to sit at home waiting to find out if he had been chosen or discarded. If she needed time to find out what she wanted, then he needed that same time to find out what he wanted too, and he was not going to spend it standing still. Sarah had not expected that answer. She had walked into that conversation prepared for anger, prepared for pleading, prepared even for him to simply say no. She had not prepared for a version of Michael who would meet her decision with a decision of his own, calm and unshaken. And in that moment, the balance between them shifted in a way neither of them fully understood yet, though both of them could feel it. 2 weeks later, Sarah packed the suitcase that had been sitting by the door and left for Colorado, where Ryan had been living since leaving the military. Michael watched her drive away from the same house they had bought together 9 years earlier, and as her car disappeared down the street, he made a private decision of his own, one he had not told her about, one that would change everything about what she would find waiting for her whenever she decided to come back. The house felt different the moment Sarah's car turned the corner and disappeared. Michael stood in the driveway for a long time after she left, longer than he would admit to anyone who asked him about it later, trying to process the fact that his wife of 11 years had just driven away to go find out if she still loved another man. He did not call anyone that first night. He did not tell his parents or his brother or the friends who would eventually need to know. He simply went inside, sat in a house that suddenly felt far too large for one person, and let himself feel every part of what had just happened before he allowed himself to think about what came next. The private decision Michael had made before Sarah left was not dramatic in the way people often expect from stories like this. He had not decided to seek revenge, and he had not decided to fall apart. He had decided quietly and deliberately that he was not going to spend the coming weeks waiting by the phone hopping for updates. He gave himself permission to live, fully and without guilt, during the time Sarah had asked for. He started going to the gym again, something he had let go of years earlier. He picked up a hobby he had abandoned in his 20s, restoring an old motorcycle in the garage, something that gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through everything else. He was not trying to punish Sarah, he was trying to become someone he could respect, regardless of what she eventually decided. Word spread quickly among their circle of friends, the way it always does, and reactions were sharply divided. Sarah's sister Kayla was furious, calling the arrangement humiliating and telling anyone who would listen that Michael should have said no from the very beginning. Michael's best friend since college, a man named Tyler, told him bluntly over beers one night that he was being far too generous, that no marriage should survive a request like the one Sarah had made. But Michael's mother, surprisingly, told him something different. She told him that sometimes people need to lose something to understand what it was actually worth, and that if his marriage was strong enough, it would survive Sarah's search for an answer, and if it wasn't, he deserved to know that now rather than in another 11 years. Weeks into the separation, updates trickled in through mutual friends, each one landing like a small shock. Someone mentioned seeing photos of Sarah and Ryan together at a mountain town outside of Denver, smiling in a way that looked, at least on the surface, like two people who had found exactly what they were looking for. Michael felt that report land somewhere deep in his chest, but he did not call her, and he did not ask questions. He had promised himself he would not chase updates, and he held to that promise even when it cost him sleep. A few weeks after that, a different friend mentioned something else entirely, a comment Sarah had made in passing that suggested things with Ryan were not as effortless as the photographs made them look, that old relationships, once reopened, do not always fit the same way they used to. By the 2-month mark, the story among their friends had shifted twice already, first toward the assumption that Sarah was gone for good, then toward whispers that something had changed, that the reunion with Ryan was not unfolding the way either of them had expected. Michael refused to build his hopes on second-hand information, but he could not fully stop himself from noticing the shift either. What none of their friends knew, and what Sarah herself did not yet know, was that Michael was no longer the same man who had watched her car disappear down the street 2 months earlier. And when Sarah finally reached out to him directly for the first time since leaving, the conversation that followed would set the final act of this story into motion. The call came on a Sunday evening in late November, almost 3 months to the day since Sarah had driven away. Michael was in the garage when his phone lit up with her name, and he stood there for a moment just staring at the screen before he answered, feeling something he had not expected to feel, a strange calm rather than the panic he had assumed would come with this exact moment. Sarah's voice sounded different when he picked up, thinner somehow, less certain than the version of her who had sat across from him at their kitchen table months earlier and laid out her terms with such quiet confidence. She asked if they could talk properly, not over the phone, and asked if she could come back to Ohio to see him in person. What Sarah told Michael when she finally sat across from him again was not the story either of them had expected her to bring home. Life with Ryan had not unraveled through some dramatic betrayal or explosive fight. It had unraveled slowly, the way most illusions do, worn down by the simple accumulation of ordinary days. The version of Ryan she had carried in her memory for over a decade, frozen at 22, full of promise and unfinished potential, did not match the man he had actually become. He was kind, she admitted, but he was also a stranger wearing a familiar face, someone whose daily habits, opinions, and rhythms had grown in directions she had never got to witness. She had not been chasing Ryan at all, she realized somewhere around the 2-month mark. She had been chasing a version of her own life that had never actually existed outside of her imagination. But the revelation that truly reshaped the room that evening was not Sarah's. It was Michael's. He told her calmly and without cruelty about the months she had been gone, about the version of himself he had rebuilt in her absence, the gym, the motorcycle, the long nights spent figuring out who he was when he was not simply reacting to someone else's needs. And then he told her something she had not been prepared to hear at all. During the separation, he had gone on a handful of dates, nothing serious, nothing he was ashamed of, but real enough that he had felt, for the first time in years, what it was like to be seen by someone new. He was not telling her this to hurt her. He was telling her because fairness demanded it, because she had asked for the same freedom to explore, and he had simply taken her at her word. Sarah sat with that information for a long moment before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice carried something Michael had not heard from her in years: real vulnerability, stripped of the careful control she had walked into their kitchen with months earlier. She told him she understood that she had no right to feel the sting she was feeling, but that she felt it anyway, sharp and immediate, and that the feeling itself had taught her something important. It taught her that the idea of losing Michael, actually losing him, mattered to her far more than the fantasy of Ryan ever had. She said she wanted to come home, not because Colorado had failed her, but because somewhere in the middle of all of it, she had finally figured out what she actually wanted, and it had been sitting in Ohio the entire time. Michael did not answer her right away. He told her he needed time to think, the same courtesy she had asked of him months earlier, and for the first time since this entire story began, it was Sarah's turn to sit in uncertainty, waiting to find out whether the man she had left behind still wanted her back at all. Michael spent the next 3 weeks doing something he had not fully done since Sarah first sat him down at that kitchen table months earlier. He actually let himself sit still with the question, without rushing toward an answer just to end the discomfort of not knowing. He talked to his mother again, the same woman whose words had steadied him back in September. He talked to Tyler, who admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that the Michael standing in front of him now was not the same man who had watched Sarah's car disappear down the street, and that whatever he decided, he was deciding it as someone whole, not someone desperate to be chosen. For the first time in this entire story, Michael was not reacting to Sarah's timeline. He was operating entirely on his own. The answer, when it finally came, surprised even Michael himself. He called Sarah on a Thursday evening and told her yes, he wanted to try again. But not as a return to the marriage they used to have. That marriage, he told her plainly, was the one that had allowed both of them to drift quietly toward other people without either of them noticing until it was almost too late. What he was offering instead was something new, built from everything they had both learned in the months apart, a relationship with fewer assumptions and far more honesty, one where neither of them would ever again mistake comfort for certainty. Sarah cried when he said it, and for once Michael did not feel the need to comfort her out of the tears. He simply let her feel them. They did not rush back into the old rhythms of married life. They dated again deliberately, the way they had when they first met in that Ohio coffee shop over a decade earlier, except this time they both understood exactly how fragile a life together actually is, and exactly how easily it can be taken for granted. Ryan Callahan eventually faded back into the past where he belonged, not as a villain in this story, but simply as a chapter that had needed to be reopened and finally closed for good. Sarah later admitted that the version of Michael she came home to was, in many ways, a better match for her than the version she had left behind, not because he had changed to please her, but because he had changed entirely for himself. What this story ultimately reveals is not a simple lesson about forgiveness or betrayal. It is a far more uncomfortable truth about long relationships, the idea that certainty is not something you are simply handed at the altar and allowed to keep forever without maintenance. It has to be tested, sometimes in ways that feel unbearable, before two people can know for certain that they are still choosing each other and not merely defaulting to each other out of habit. Michael and Sarah's marriage did not survive because nothing ever went wrong between them. It survived because when everything did go wrong, they both had the courage to find out what they actually wanted, even at the risk of losing each other completely. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If your partner came to you tomorrow and asked for exactly what Sarah asked of Michael, would you have said yes the way he did? And if you did say yes, do you believe you would have found your own way back to yourself in the meantime, the way Michael managed to, or do you think you would have simply waited by the door, hoping to be chosen?